What's going on, everybody? I am Brandon Marcello, joined by John Talty here at the top of the show. This is the College Football Insiders here on CBS Sports Network. Thanks for joining us. The college football coaching carousel is in full, just absolute rumor mode, chaos mode, and everybody is just trying to throw around as much money as they can at Lane Kiffin to see if he will come to their school. Let's just jump right into it. We got a lot to talk about on this show, especially with the carousel. And we also want to do some early transfer portal chatter later in the show with our Chris Hummer. John, so this past weekend, we finally got some announcement for an announcement when it comes to Lane Kiffin, the Ole Miss head coach, letting it be known to his athletics director, Keith Carter at Ole Miss, that, hey, I'll let you know about my future after the Egg Bowl. So we're all expecting some sort of announcement this upcoming Saturday about whether Lane Kiffin's going to stay at Ole Miss or go to LSU or go to Florida. So let's set the stage here. On Saturday and on Friday, we started hearing some murmurs about the type of package that LSU was preparing to throw in front of Lane Kiffin to see if they can entice him to come down to Baton Rouge and lead their program after firing Brian Kelly. On Saturday, looked more into it myself and was able to track down some particulars. The big thing here is just the big dollar number that'll stick out. They've got a package put together that could be worth more than $98 million over 7 years. Now, there's a lot of things in this contract that they are going over line by line to make sure they try to get to that number. It's very incentive laden. And so a lot of bonuses also in there in particular that could lead to him making more than 98 million. So we're talking about $100 million in that contract. One thing I couldn't track down is whether the contract was fully guaranteed, because that seems to be the popular thing among these top tier coaches if they want to leave a job. But 7 years, $98 million. If we average that out, that's about $14 million a year, which would make Lane Kiffin, as of today, the richest, most well-paid coach in college football. John, what do you think about all this chatter, and how crazy is this Egg Bowl going to be week going to be for Ole Miss and Lane Kiffin as they prepare for Mississippi State on Friday?
Well, one, it's interesting that there was all that conversation around Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry basically being like, we don't want to get in contracts like we did with Brian Kelly again. And I was like, if it's Lane Kiffin, maybe we will. That didn't last very long. We're not going to spend a lot of money on a coach. But it's a fascinating situation. It feels like in some ways like time is a flat circle. Brandon, as you remember, it was 3 years ago leading into the Egg Bowl.
True Detective was in Louisiana. So, hey.
It all comes back around. 3 years ago, it looks like Lane Kiffin was going to Auburn. And it was really, if I remember correctly, it was the eve of the Egg Bowl where it finally leaked out that, no, I'm actually going to stay at Ole Miss. So we are coming back up again where the dominant theme for the Egg Bowl is, will Lane Kiffin stay or go? In some ways, that's unfortunate. Like, Brandon, you and I are both Egg Bowl veterans. Like, that's an incredible game. It is one of the wildest, most, in some ways, mean-spirited rivalry games in all of college football. This adds a whole nother layer to that. But all anybody right now that I talk to wants to know about Lane Kiffin. I'm sure you're getting it too, Brandon. Like, I literally talked to an AD earlier today about something completely different from this, and there was still, let me ask you a quick question about Lane Kiffin. Like, that's all anybody wants to know. Like, what is this guy going to do? And what maybe is one of the most fascinating aspects of it is that the carousel is kind of waiting on Lane's decision. There's all these if, then, what type scenarios that involve him and what he decides to do. So everyone's kind of waiting to see what is he going to do. And I think we're expecting, finality on that next Saturday.
Yeah, this especially affects the situation, obviously, at Florida, because Florida's made it pretty clear that Lane Kiffin's number one on their list right now, too. And John, you and our Matt Zenitz reported earlier this weekend that right now Florida appears to be third in the running for Lane Kiffin's services. It looks like LSU's got the momentum right now, followed by Ole Miss and staying there. And then it's Florida, which, by the way, that's opened the door for these other candidates at Florida to where I know some of them, speaking to a couple of them this past weekend myself, that they're sitting back going, oh, I need to kind of rethink my situation at the school I'm at and potentially going to this job when Florida might end up coming back and calling me. So now this is going to be something where not only could it affect Florida, obviously, but some other programs, including in the SEC, that are waiting to hear some word from some of their top tier candidates. So Florida is really a big linchpin in all this as well, no matter what Lane Kiffin does.
Very much so. To your point, I mean, I think a couple jobs, Auburn, Arkansas, you might be interested in some people that also could be interested in Florida and that Florida is potentially interested in. So that I think is what makes this tricky. And I think, I'll just use those two as examples. I think both Auburn and Arkansas have done a very good job to this point in the search. Arkansas has talked to a lot of people, as you've reported, Brandon. Auburn's been a bit smaller pool, but they've done good due diligence. They've talked to the right people they should be talking to. They've put themselves in a very good position to make what I think will be an impactful hire. But Florida is one of those that could maybe throw a wrench into that. And then, I mean, right now we feel like Lane is trending more toward LSU than anywhere else. But if he stays, then you now have LSU in the mix that might be circling back on some of those candidates as well. So it just has the impact to really impact multiple different searches beyond just Florida, LSU. It can go all the way down the line. And then that, of course, impacts other searches. Like it's all kind of one potential domino, and Lane is the big one that I think will start toppling over other things. But Oklahoma State, there are other programs that have interest and feel like they have a shot, but if maybe the guy above them turns down that job or takes a different job, it impacts them.
Yeah, this is going to be a fast and furious weekend after the season ends. And I know there's a couple of jobs out there that they're trying to make hires or at least whittle it down and get deals start writing up in place here this week before games are played. So keep an eye on some of those jobs outside of Ole Miss, Florida, and LSU as well. So Lane Kiffin, if he were to go to LSU, could he bring Ed Orgeron with him? As our Matt Zenitz reported earlier last week that LSU's open to that possibility.
Which would be obviously a tremendous, I think, thing for LSU, for Ed Orgeron. I mean, I think, Brandon, on our podcast, I've said numerous times, we need Edo back in the SEC. I'm pretty sure on one of our previous episodes, I even threw out, keep an eye on this possibility. If he's willing to be a defensive line coach, I could see him being willing to do that for Lane. So it'd be a great pairing. I think that Lane would bring / put together a very good staff at LSU. I think there's multiple guys that I think would, eyeball emoji if you kind of put them all together. But Edo, I think, would be a big piece of that. He is Louisiana through and through. There's probably no better recruiter than Ed Orgeron. And I think that would be huge, I think, for Lane, who is, as you know, Brandon, he's great at the portal, maybe not as good at high school recruiting. Having Ed have a big hand in that, I think, would be very important, especially in a state like Louisiana where there's so much talent that you are expected to get at LSU, and something, frankly, that Brian Kelly struggled with his first couple of years at LSU, not prioritizing the state of Louisiana.
Yeah, and the thing that was not the issue for Brian Kelly this past year was the transfer portal. They had so much money to throw into that, especially after missing out on quarterback Bryce Underwood, who ended up going to Michigan. That saved them a lot of money that they were able to reinvest into the portal and brought in arguably the best, if not the best, portal class in America. And yet LSU's in the position it's in right now where they've got an interim coach and they're trying to throw all their money once again at getting a top-tier guy like a Lane Kiffin. Back to Ole Miss, and as we get into the 11th hour, before the clock strikes midnight, we decide if Lane Kiffin stays a Rebel or turns into a Bayou Bengal. We talk about ultimatums and whether Keith Carr, the athletics director, there said, hey, there's a hard and fast deadline on all of this. Was that true? And also, how frustrating has this been for all the people in the administration there at Ole Miss?
Yeah, I had not heard the specific word ultimatum. I know that was reported elsewhere, but certainly it was, a step below that maybe, but a strong desire for clarity. That might be pretty similar to the definition of ultimatum, but the exact word ultimatum wasn't used. But it is interesting, Brandon, talking to people around the situation, even leading into Friday, where there are questions like, I wonder if this is the day where an actual ultimatum might actually happen. And, there's still been few details coming out of that meeting. I think they purposely are trying to keep quiet. And as you've noticed, like Lane Kiffin's been pretty quiet on social media, which is not necessarily his usual style. So I think that is interesting. But it is definitely frustrating. They've been through this before, as we talked about with the Auburn situation. That was a deeply frustrating situation. And I think that they are, understandably annoyed that this is overshadowing what is one of the greatest Ole Miss football seasons in their history. And you want to be thinking about, man, we might be hosting a home game, a home playoff game here in a couple weeks. Imagine what that would mean for Oxford. I'm already thinking about how hard it'd be to get hotels in Oxford for that. But that would be a huge boon for a small SEC town. And instead, we're thinking about, I wonder who's going to be the interim if Lane leaves. So it's unfortunate that I think is carrying on. But I give Keith Carter, the Ole Miss AD, a lot of credit for how he has handled it. It is an almost impossible situation to try to navigate. And I think he has done a good job of both protecting the institution, but not pushing Lane out. He's trying to kind of thread the needle in some ways, as is Lane. And it's a very challenging situation. And it puts Ole Miss in a really tough spot in a lot of ways. But I feel like they've done a good job in doing their best to try to manage that.
Yeah, as much as they at Lane and everybody has said that they don't want to go through what happened 3 years ago with the Auburn job, this all is the same thing, except the difference is that Ole Miss is not going on a weird losing streak like they did near the end of that season. This could still very much be a distraction. It can be especially a distraction if your coach comes out on Saturday and says, I'm leaving. Good luck in the playoffs, guys. That would, and if Ole Miss loses their first round game, Lane might end up being an absolute villain in Oxford for years to come.
What if they lose the Egg Bowl? I mean,
gosh.
we think that they are in, but if they're 10-2, they lost the Egg Bowl and Lane is gone, are they a guarantee to be in? I think that gets a little tricky. And that, I mean, the absolute doomsday scenario, and I have unfortunately had this conversation with different people, but the thing that will turn him to the ultimate villain, that will have Ole Miss fans going nuts, is if they somehow miss the playoff because of this. Now, I think that is unlikely, but if you drop a real stinker against Mississippi State, listen, they're licking their chops over this whole scenario. They want this one bad, and there might be an opportunity here of all the drama overshadowing things.
That might be the all-time Egg Bowl moment if Mississippi State beats Ole Miss and Lane Kiffin leaves town. That of all the crazy Egg Bowl moments. And by the way, everybody, our John Talty on CBSSports.com later this week is going to chronicle the craziest Egg Bowl moments. And as a former Mississippi State beat writer, and as John has worked in the state of Mississippi covering both programs there in the past, it's one of the wildest rivalries you'll ever see off the field, and then on the field, crazy stuff happens. I can't wait to read all that. We're going to be back here on the College Football Insiders discussing Florida State, keeping Mike Norvell, Justin Wilcox out at Cal. Much more coming up right after this. Welcome back to the College Football Insiders. We're talking a lot about the coaching carousel, but also we're going to talk about some coaches who have gotten not necessarily votes of confidence, but straight up, hey, you're going to return next season despite being on the hot seat. The top name there is Florida State's coach Mike Norvell, despite being 5-6 this season and starting hot, beating Alabama in week 1. Do you guys remember that? And then going on a terrible losing streak itself, to now in a position where they might miss a bowl game if they don't beat rival Florida this upcoming week. The athletics director and the school president, Richard McCullough, recently released a statement Sunday saying, no, Mike Norvell is going to return next season, and we understand there need to be a lot of changes. Now, this very well could be a big-time money decision because Mike Norvell, had he been fired, but would have been owed north of $54 million in buyout money. And in addition to that, he has a very expensive coaching staff that would also be due buyout money. We're talking about numbers that could reach over $80 million potentially based off of my research and looking at those contracts. And then also you have to consider you'd be starting all over once again. But I wanted to bring in our John Talty to discuss this further. We've both been covering this for quite some time and been hearing murmurs for the better part of the last 4 weeks about whether Mike Norvell was actually safe. But now that we've got this word that he is safe, John, what kind of tenor is there in Tallahassee, and what kind of changes could Mike Norvell make in this offseason that he hasn't already had a chance to do over the last 3 years when they've had to reload in the transfer portal so much, so often?
I think that's what's interesting is that this is a move that we've seen schools do in the past, but I think as we've talked about this situation, Brandon, over the year, it's like he's already used some of his big moves. He already went out and got new offensive and defensive coordinators after a disappointing 2024 season. So what's next available on the table? I've heard, as I'm sure you probably have too, that could we see changes in the personnel department? I think that's going to be a move we might see more and more schools do where, all right, the coaching's not bad, but the personnel's bad. Do we see firings of GMs now in the future as they kind of gain prominence and gain in terms of the compensation they're being paid? That's one move I think that's available to you. Could you make more staff changes? I think that is very much in play. But I think whether any of that makes anyone happy, I think is very much in question. Certainly, I think Florida State fans were ready to turn the page on the Mike Norvell tenure in Tallahassee. And frankly, the timing of this, it reminds me a lot of what we talked about a week ago, Brandon, with Maryland, where you really did not want to get in the market. We've known that. Florida State has not wanted to fire Mike Norvell if they could avoid it. And after they lost this past weekend, I think the question was, man, he's going to probably have to beat Florida to hold on to his job potentially. And what you do is you try to get out in front of it, because if he loses to Florida, those boosters, which have already been trying to work behind the scenes to get rid of Norvell, would have had even more ammunition to do so. Very similar to Maryland, where Mike Locksley, probably is going to lose out, especially if he cannot beat Michigan State next weekend. Going to lose his last 8 consecutive games. If the AD had let it get to that point, it would have been even more ammo for them to get rid of him. He wanted to get out in front of it. And that's kind of how I interpreted Florida's move yesterday. Let's get out in front of this. Let's not let this Florida game hang over everything, because we really don't want to get rid of this guy.
Yeah, because you had just had the chatter ramping up and have been so negative this week, and especially would have been terrible just in the 24 hours after that Florida game. And there would have been more pressure to actually make the change. And you probably would have had some boosters, for example, who hadn't quite made their voice known, would have stepped up at that point, and it would have put the athletics director and that department in a much more difficult position to just say, no, we can't make this move. But Florida State's just one of those programs where it seems like they were in a position to just strike real hot when they went undefeated. And in the moment Jordan Travis goes down the injury, they miss the playoff, the committee makes that decision. And then the football program has just been sliding down ever since. They go and sue the ACC trying to get more money because, hey, we're a big-time program, big-time brand. Look at us. We just won all these games, brought you all these ratings in. And then they end up having to settle, stay in the ACC, deal with this new unequal revenue sharing program that they think is going to help them. But now they're not winning games, and they're not the exact type of top-tier draw on television, as we've seen, which is what drives in dollars into the ACC that they distribute out to these programs. So it just seems like all the bets they've made have come up just an absolute bust. And at this point, this is their last bet. This is their last chance going into next year. And I really wonder what this program and its standing is a year from now if this fails once again under Mike Norvell.
And here's the worst case scenario. It just happened to one of their in-state rivals. Florida takes the patient approach. Let's give him all the resources we can to have one more year, when plenty of people wanted to get rid of Billy a year ago. They get rid of him. They set their sights on Lane Kiffin. And now it's not done. Lane Kiffin could surprise us all and end up going to Florida. But a year ago, if Florida had moved on from Billy Napier, they would have had an extremely good chance at getting Lane Kiffin. Those odds have decreased because of LSU entering into the situation. So I would be concerned if I were a Florida State fan. There's a lot of candidates out there right now, a lot of schools competing for them. I understand not wanting to get into that market. The flip side is, are you going to lose a candidate that maybe you could hire right now that a year from now you're not going to be able to get because he went somewhere else? That would be my concern. And that might be the one downside of kicking the can down the road, especially if it does not work. And for all the reasons that we talked about, Brandon, Mike's a nice guy. Would love for it to work for him. I am skeptical that the changes that they have available to them are going to lead to a massive difference in win-loss record a year from now.
Yeah, it just seems like last year going into this year, it was, well, keep your eyes on Florida. That's the big job that's going to probably come up, and we all know it. It seems like Florida State's going to take that preseason mantle going into next year. Okay, much more about the coaching carousel. We're going to go through intel at multiple schools all down the line, coming up next on the College Football Insiders. Welcome back to the College Football Insiders. I am Brandon Marcello, joined now by Richard Johnson. We're going to go through a lot of intel and information, things we're hearing across the college football landscape with the coaching carousel. Not just coaches that are in the running for some jobs, but maybe some jobs that could open here in the last week after this regular season, a rivalry week. I saw a coach earlier today even saying, like, pretty much doing a shoulder shrug emoji about their future. It's just, it's wild, college football. I can't believe it. Richard, first off, just because this, I believe is happening today based off of the information that was shared with me on Saturday, Penn State, their job, of course, open since firing James Franklin earlier this season. Terry Smith, very well liked coach, a position coach there at Penn State. He's been the interim coach there. They just shellacked Nebraska. I was at that game this past weekend, and Terry Smith was on the football field going along these sidelines, just celebrating like crazy throughout that game. The players being all around him. It was senior night. They were supporting him. He was even wearing a lapel that said Joe 409, which is something that obviously honors Joe Paterno, that depending on which side of the fence you sit with that whole situation with Joe Paterno and his legacy, you either love to see, but also heard a lot of Penn State fans just not going, that's not a good look. We shouldn't be wearing that. But the players there absolutely love him. I saw some of the players on the field afterward holding up signs saying, hire Terry Smith. Well, Terry Smith is getting his formal interview this week, and word is that interview is happening on Monday with the athletics director, Pat Kraft. My question, Richard, to you is Terry Smith a legitimate candidate to take over the Nittany Lions?
What I think is interesting about this Penn State search, Brandon, is that this Penn State search has been so quiet. And I think Penn State administrators, up to and including athletic director Pat Kraft, are very proud of how quiet it has been so far. I think nature abhors a vacuum. And so into that vacuum, you have stuff like Terry Smith interviewing for the job. I don't think Terry Smith will be a legitimate sort of first-line candidate for the job. I think it's really good that they are interviewing him and giving him a fair shake. He is certainly somebody who is held in very, very high regard by players, staff, just about anybody you can ask inside or outside that Penn State program rave about Terry Smith personally. I think that the 409 pin that you were talking about just earlier, that is a clear beacon to the Joe Paterno loyalists on Penn State's board, who will certainly have one hand or some sway over which direction this hire goes. If you're an interim head coach, I think you have at any job, by the way, I think you have a very compelling case to say, hire me for relatively cheaper, and then we'll pump that money into the roster, and we'll keep this thing swinging in the right direction in the days of having to compensate players. So I think that Smith getting an interview is just part of the process. And I also think it speaks to what part of the process Penn State is in right now. You're only just getting around to interviewing the guy who's been in your building for years, but been in the seat for weeks. You know what I mean? I think right now Penn State is going through a very deliberate process, more deliberate than a Florida or an Auburn or an LSU.
Yeah, and this is a situation at Penn State where you've already seen a couple of those top tier coaches that may have been targets, especially Nebraska's Matt Rule, who just came into Penn State and lost in his return to his home state. Also an alum of Penn State and an alum of State College High School, the big high school there in the city. And he said, no, I'm going to stay at Nebraska. Of course, you had Indiana's Kurt Cignetti pretty much just sit there at his desk, and his athletics director walked in and go, hey, do you want to stay here at Indiana? He's like, yeah, just work up the contract, do it. And they got it done immediately. And so Penn State's had to not necessarily regroup, but look at their situation. And one of the bigger names, I say bigger, but he's a fast rising name that's been on the radar a little bit more often here over the last week I've been hearing is James Madison coach Bob Chesney, who has been in the running for the job on the West Coast at UCLA, but I've been told it's kind of slow playing that a little bit to see if his name starts to bubble up a little bit more here at Penn State, especially as the regular season comes to a close. But Penn State's going to be one of those jobs where I think they could literally make a hire anytime within the next 10 days, or they can stretch this out a little bit further if they have to, and just to make sure they get the right guy. And as you said, Pat Kraft has been running a tight ship. Little personal moment for you. I was texting him all week on, hey, I'm coming to State College. Love to see you. Love to see you. Never returned.
Nothing.
And then I see him on the field afterward, and I go up to him, and I go, hey, Pat, it's good to see you. He's like, hey, man, how you doing? Boop.
Uh-huh.
He left. Pat Kraft's one of the nicest guys out there, but he's focused. Like, you're not getting anything from me. I got to go. So that's the situation Penn State is in, and a great job, obviously. And my first time up there, that place is gigantic, and they love their football at Penn State. Okay, let's move down the line. There's a lot of job openings that have been open for quite some time that should be nearing their end. And I'm speaking specifically about Arkansas, Oklahoma State, UCLA, and then even we're going to talk a little bit about Auburn, because Auburn's in a situation that could be affected based off of what Lane Kiffin does. Not directly, but because of it. If he doesn't go to Florida, there's some things to watch there. We'll start with Arkansas. It's been an interesting couple of weeks for the Razorbacks as far as their coaching search. I've done a lot of reporting on it. It's in my backyard. I'm from this area. The Razorbacks have interviewed at least 22 candidates throughout their process since they fired head coach Sam Pittman in late September. A lot of discussions with candidates there. It appears it's nearing its end. On Sunday, I reported through our 24/7 Sports affiliate that candidates have been told to expect some clarity within the next 48 hours about where everything stands, and that potentially they could make a decision and make a hire there. Will that happen? Coaching searches are fluid, everybody, and I can tell you there are 4 to 5 candidates still involved in this process at Arkansas. There's also some sitting Power 4 head coaches that are interested, or at least have been talked to as well. And I know of one coach in the Big 12 that is interested in the job, but doesn't want to talk to Arkansas or anybody else until the season ends. So the question is, are the Razorbacks going to be willing to wait for that, or have they already kind of made their decision among the finalists and candidates they've already spoken to? But some of the names to watch there here, at least here in the early part of this week, as we near this point of clarity, as the candidates have been told, are the likes of Eric Morris at North Texas, Alex Golesh at USF, Kane Womack, the defensive coordinator at Alabama, is also someone to watch. And then there's been some discussions, a lot, especially in the industry, about Iowa State coach Matt Campbell, potentially on the radar here of late for the Razorbacks. But again, that's not the Big 12 coach I was talking about. Be reporting that out here further as we get some more information on that. So keep an eye on the Razorbacks. Something could be happening here this week. Meanwhile, Oklahoma State, it's been kind of quiet there, but the name that has always been popping up, Richard, is Eric Morris. Makes a lot of sense. Great offensive program. He could bring in some of those players immediately to Oklahoma State, get that thing going. It's the type of offense Oklahoma State fans are accustomed to seeing. Where do things stand right now with the Cowboys?
Well, from my end, my question about this Oklahoma State search has been, when I talk to sources, I talk to coaches, I talk to agents, whoever, it's how much money do you think Oklahoma State has to devote to its roster? And it's my understanding that Oklahoma State is trying to get a package together to put themselves in the top 3 of rev share situations in the conference. They're not there right now. And a lot of that has to do with Mike Gundy's own resistance to the new NIL rev share era. But it's not just Mike Gundy. There were some people, sort of some fundraising people and some money people in the Oklahoma State kind of apparatus that were themselves a little resistant to making those changes and giving Mike potentially what he would need just theoretically to be competitive from a financial perspective. So there's, I think, a lot of different reasons why Oklahoma State was in the financial position as far as its roster is concerned that they are currently in. It's my understanding that they are willing to up that up and willing to be competitive with the highest ends of their conference from a revenue distribution to the roster standpoint. And because of that, I think that whoever it is, and particularly if it's Eric Morris, considering the quarterback he's going to bring in, that quarterback is going to fetch a pretty penny. if the going rate for a high level quarterback in the portal is going to be north of $3 million, well, you better have a money apparatus for your roster that's competitive with the highest levels of the conference.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like with Oklahoma State or even in Arkansas, for example, when it comes to Eric Morris, it's going to be one, you got to pay me. But also, I would think that you're also hiring me to potentially have my quarterback follow me, and you're going to have to pay him very well as well. Okay, UCLA, that's a position that's been open for quite some time. I mentioned earlier Bob Chesney at James Madison. His name has been coming up there as well. One, just how good is this job as it stands right now, and what are we hearing here lately?
Well, it just depends on, it's similar to Oklahoma State, quite frankly. It depends on where the resources are going to be allocated to that roster, because that's not an upper half of the Big Ten revenue distribution, or excuse me, rev share number for that roster. So it's, you just have to ask yourself, if you're taking that UCLA job, where are the resources being allocated? There is a very open question as to whether UCLA will be staying in the Rose Bowl, for instance. They may be going to play their home games at SoFi Stadium. The Rose Bowl's not just going to let them walk out of a long-term contract. That's going to be its own litigation. So where will you be playing your games in the LA metro area? So there are some open questions around this UCLA job, in my opinion. And, if I'm Bob Chesney, and Brandon, you're saying that Bob Chesney may be kind of slow playing UCLA, or that's kind of the impression that's being left right now. I get it. If you're kind of waiting to see, well, where does this UCLA job really suss out as far as resource allocation?
Then you look at Auburn right now. It's been pretty clear that one of their top targets is John Summerall at Tulane, and he is someone that a week ago came up as a potential interview at Florida. Then that interview ended up not happening for whatever reason. And then now we've got Florida in a situation where they're waiting to see what Lane Kiffin's going to say, if he's going to stay at Ole Miss or go to LSU. Our Matt Zenitz and John Talty reporting that it appears Florida is third in that race right now. So where does Florida turn if they do not get a Lane Kiffin? Could we see some of these other candidates on the periphery, say like a Tulane's John Summerall, who was involved in Auburn as one of their targets, come up all of a sudden at Florida?
Yeah, I do wonder if Florida takes another approach at John Summerall and takes another crack at John Summerall as one of a few plan Bs if it doesn't happen to be Lane Kiffin. But the other job with John Summerall that we have to keep in the forefront is Ole Miss. Because if Lane Kiffin ends up leaving Ole Miss, I think John Summerall is going to be priority number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 for Ole Miss. They are going to get on the phone with John Summerall, and they are going to try to slide in there and try to beat out Auburn for John Summerall's signature.
Ole Miss has a crazy good apparatus there with their NIL, and of course they're going to be willing to pay just about what anybody else is going to pay in the SEC, and he's got a lot of connections there as well. Fascinating stuff, Richard, and we're going to come back here after this break. We're going to get into the transfer portal. It's not open yet, but there's already a lot of buzz around there, especially among some quarterbacks potentially entering the portal. Coming up next. Welcome back to the College Football Insiders. I'm Brandon Marcello, joined by Chris Hummer. Hummer, what is the first emotion that comes to your mind when I say Portal Palooza?
Maybe a little bit of an excitement and a little bit of dread. Like, what, I don't know what that word mixed together is, but it's already started, man. It feels like I've tweeted about 200 portal guys in the last 48 hours.
Yeah, transfer portal doesn't open.
Doesn't open
January
2nd. Yeah, January 2nd. But it is a relentless pursuit, the transfer portal, and it is in full swing right now. And I think if you talk to people around the sport, deals are already being struck behind the scenes for guys who haven't even announced that they've entered the portal. That's how quickly this is going to move.
All right, so let's go into that right now. And one of the top names we're already discussing is Arizona State quarterback Sam Leavitt, who's had a tremendous last couple of seasons there, leading them to the playoff last year. And now in a situation where he's been injured, not playing. Jeff Sims, who's come in and replaced him out of necessity and has done great. He's thrown for 200 yards in 2 of the last 3 games. First time he's thrown for 200 yards since the 2021 season when he was at Georgia Tech. But Sam Leavitt sitting there now on the sideline contemplating his future and whether to stay at Arizona State. Could this be the top quarterback in the portal coming up? Chris, what are we hearing on Sam Leavitt's future?
Well, it's a complicated situation. And in all fairness, like all transfer portal situations this time of year are complicated. I wrote a piece on this last week when all this was kind of breaking from another company. And obviously Sam Leavitt rumors have been flying around for a while. I've been hearing them since October. Like that is a reality. There is an open question about whether Sam Leavitt will return to Arizona State. But it's not a guarantee by any means that he leaves. I spoke to Sam Leavitt's brother, Dallin, when all this was happening last week, and he said there's a lot of dominoes left to fall. And I very much agree with that. I think Arizona State believes it's in Sam Leavitt's best interest to return. There are just a lot of factors that go into this, money being one of them. Like Arizona State is a program that doesn't take the full rev share. I think they distributed around $18 million this year. If you do some napkin math, it's probably $13 million or so for football. And in a market where Sam Leavitt would command upwards of $3 million, like you're talking about potentially 25% of your cap going to one player. That's a significant investment in somebody like Sam Leavitt. And on the other side of things, it's also complicated for Sam Leavitt. Like he's coming off an injury. He may not be ready for spring football. He might have to go somewhere like Carson Beck did this year and learn a whole new system without being able to really throw. So there's a lot that goes into that. And I haven't even mentioned decisions on the roster. Like somebody like Jordan Tyson has to decide what he's going to do. So there's just so much that still needs to be determined there.
Yeah, Jordan Tyson, arguably, no matter if Sam Leavitt is on the field or not, is the best player on that team. He's just absolutely electric at receiver for them. Now, moving on from Sam Leavitt, but staying at the quarterback spot, which schools out there do you believe immediately in January are going to be, we've got to get a quarterback in the portal, that are going to be big game hunting and throwing money around to get one of these top tier names, whoever they are, when they enter the portal?
Well, we can talk about a couple of names I think are likely to go just based on situation. But if you're talking about schools that need it, I mean, Texas Tech comes up. Like nobody spends more money than Texas Tech, as we've seen this year. Miami absolutely comes up. Like that program is as secret as it gets, like how they move with quarterbacks. But like I feel pretty confident saying they're probably gonna be in that market. And if they are, we've seen how aggressively they'll spend. I mean, Miami is arguably had the two highest paid quarterbacks in college football the last 2 seasons, depending on how
Right.
you split some Darian Mensah versus Carson Beck dollars. So those are two schools that could really push the market up. I know Indiana certainly is going to have to look at a quarterback. LSU, whenever it hires a new head coach, whoever that is, most likely Lane Kiffin, based on everything we've heard as a company and me individually. We'll have to go get a quarterback. I can think of several other schools that are going to be in that market. Maybe not like the top tier schools in terms of like tier one choices for these guys, but all of those schools are going to need some, plus another dozen plus others. So it'll be a healthy market out there.
So give me, you said there are some names we can discuss. Who are some quarterbacks we should be keeping an eye on of maybe potentially entering the portal that we'll be talking about in a month?
Well, it's not just the portal. I would put it this way. So I was talking with somebody very familiar with the quarterback market the other day and the coaching side. And they basically pointed to Lenore Sellers and Dante Moore as the swing guys for the offseason. I'm not expecting Dante Moore to transfer. I want to put that out there first. But he does have an NFL decision, which could impact Oregon jumping into the market, right? And
Right.
then Lenore Sellers is very interesting. Lenore Sellers has a stay or go decision with the NFL, but he's also got a stay or go decision upcoming with South Carolina. South Carolina is obviously searching for an offensive coordinator right now. I know that's a guy some people are wondering what he'll do. And then if you just look at situations, right? Like Austin Simmons started the year as the starter for Ole Miss. He has been benched for Trinidad Chambliss. Injury played a role in that, but he's the guy you could see exploring his options, certainly. And I think a guy like Drew Mestamaker, who I heard you mention earlier, could be very popular in the open market if he goes. And if you're looking for another G5 name to keep an eye on, a guy named Colton Joseph at Old Dominion is somebody that people bring up often as a popular name if he chose to enter the portal. Decisions still have to be made, but that's a market that could be pretty robust. And there's a lot more names, like an Aiden Childs, for example, that come up often, and Aiden being a guy who was also benched earlier this year. So
Yeah,
there's
benched
a
and
lot
his
of
coach
questions.
and his yeah, benched and his coach Jonathan Smith's future very much up in the air. And earlier today was asked about his future, saying, "Is your AD talk to you?" And he's like, "Yeah, that's not really, no." So there's so much in flux, not just the coaching carousel, but the transfer portal opening up here in more than a month. We're still more than a month away from that. Chris Summer, thanks for joining us. He's going to come back here after this break as we discuss one of the hot names out there as far as just offensive coordinators, and Oregon's Will Stein, and maybe someone that could be a potential big name on the carousel, either that's this year or the next couple of years. It's the College Football Insiders. We're back. I'm Brendan Marcello, Chris Hummer joining me. And here we're going to discuss a coach that maybe you haven't quite heard of, but deserves a lot of credit for what's happening at Oregon in these last couple of years. And that's offensive coordinator Will Stein. The 36-year-old has been absolutely marvelous in dialing up plays and getting these quarterbacks some big numbers over the years. And you see Oregon now, their yards per play is near the top in the country. They just beat USC in a game that was really a must-win for them to keep a kind of a steady hand on getting into the playoff out of the Big Ten. And we're going to talk with Chris Hummer here a little bit about Will Stein, his background, and what you really need to know about this 36-year-old play caller who might one day, whether it's soon in this coaching carousel cycle or another year or two, could be a huge name on the coaching carousel circuit. So, Chris, what do we need to know about this guy? What kind of play caller and what kind of man is Will Stein?
Well, I mean, from a production standpoint, I don't think you can do much better. He's been a play caller for 4 years, 1 year at UTSA and 3 seasons at Oregon. He's had a top 20 scoring offense every year. His quarterback that season had their career high in completion percentage every year, including Bo Nix setting the NCAA completion percentage record when he had him in 2023. And he just puts up points. Like that's the reality of Will Stein. I talked to Jeff Traylor, UTSA's head coach, for this story, a really good friend of Stein and a mentor for him. And he said, Will is not afraid to score. And he goes, Chris, like you're probably thinking like, obviously everybody wants to score, but Will Stein is not afraid to score. And I think he calls games with a rhythm and an aggressiveness that really impress people in the industry. And he's also, frankly, just somebody people really like. Traylor told me a story I didn't include in the piece, but Will Stein actually lived with Jeff Traylor when he was a quality control coach in Texas back in the day when Charlie Strong was the head coach there. And Traylor, who was living in his uncle's house at the time, because he was there away from his family, used to go check Will Stein's room every day. And one thing he would notice is Will always made his bed. Like every single day, Will Stein made his bed. And Jeff Traylor was just kind of like, if he's willing to make his bed every day, he's like consistent and reliable and one of the people you can count on. And I think that's just something people say about him. He's just a really popular figure. People call him Will Sunshine Stein because of his personality and his attitude. And I think he's a guy who was he was an offensive coordinator in high school 8 years ago. And I think is on the fast track in the sport to be a head coach.
Yeah, let me throw it out there, okay? If he's not someone that's on the move this year, let's say longtime Kentucky coach Mark Stoops leaves Kentucky. Would Will Stein be someone that could come up at the Kentucky search because he's a Kentucky native and has a high-flying offense?
Absolutely. I mean, if I was Kentucky, I don't expect Josh Brown to move, for example, but if I was Louisville, Will Stein's alma mater, he was a starting quarterback there, famously had his job taken by Teddy Bridgewater after 2 games as the starter. If I was Louisville or Kentucky and I had a job come up, and I'd call Will Stein. But Will Stein also has really deep connections to Texas. He's somebody that I spent 8 years in the state. Let's say UNT comes open this year, right? Like, and they need to make a call. Like, I would swing at Will Stein. He might be headed for a P4 job already, to be honest. And his name has come up a little bit on this cycle,
Yeah.
But I think he is on the short list of coordinators you need to know across the sport moving forward. There's really no question about that.
If Oregon makes some noise in the playoff, I think he's one of those guys you're going to hear his name a lot in storylines on the broadcast and people like us writing about him quite a bit. This is a big-time name to keep an eye on, fellas. All right. We hope you enjoyed this show. A lot of coaching carousel intel, much more on our YouTube channel. Go and check that out. And then also go to cbssports.com for all of our coverage. Thanks for joining us. See you next week.